A national think tank called Samara conducted exit interviews with 65 former members of Parliament in Canada, and they heard about party discipline in those conversations. Most MPs said that they wanted to do politics differently and collaborate across party lines, but many former MPs felt that the final decisions from party leadership were opaque, arbitrary, and sometimes even unprofessional. So Canadian MPs are less likely to break ranks with their own party than in any other country, and this is not just an issue at the federal level. A documentary producer by the name of Sean Holman put out a new film in June called Whipped, The Secret World of Party Discipline, and in producing his documentary, he discovered that among the 32,328 votes cast in the British Columbia legislature in the last decade, just 80 of those votes, 1/4 of 1%, were cast by MLAs who voted against their own party. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of party discipline. Party discipline and the centralization of power raises questions about who our elected officials are accountable to. Is it the party leadership, their constituents, their own conscience? What does it say about the power of our legislature? And so these are some of the things that we are here to talk about tonight. So we're privileged tonight to have 4 panelists who were not only willing to put their names forward to run for public office at some point in their lives, but we're also willing to participate in this discussion with us. Our panel of speakers includes people with experience in both federal and provincial politics. They're from all across the political spectrum. Among them, they have experience as backbenchers, cabinet ministers, and party leaders. So we're really fortunate tonight to have this group with us, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you. And I'll start down at the end. This is Brent Rathgeber. He's the independent member of Parliament for the riding of Edmonton-St. Albert. He was elected in 2008 as a Conservative, but he left the Conservative caucus earlier this year out of concerns. So it's obvious what a lot of people in the room think already. So he left out of concerns around governmental transparency, citing that his constituents demand better. Before he became a federal politician, he served as a member of the Alberta legislature, and before he entered politics, he worked as a litigator. We're pleased to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, Stephanie. I'd like to thank Mark and all the members of the Springtide Collective for inviting me here to beautiful Halifax and Dalhousie. I understand you have an election going on, so this couldn't be more timely here at the birthplace of responsible government. Joseph Howe, 1848. Friends, every 4 years or so, citizens elect a group of themselves to represent them at all respective levels of government. The expectation is simple, that the elected officials will provide representation, that is, they will pass appropriate laws and that they will hold their government to account. The bureaucracy, i.e. the permanent government, does not represent taxpayers. Their job is to design and administer government programs and services. It is the elected parliament, the legislatures and municipal councils, who must represent citizens and taxpayers if citizens and taxpayers are to be represented. It is the elected bodies that must hold government to account, failing which government, by definition, will become unaccountable. Responsible government, born right here in Nova Scotia, is the essence of parliamentary accountability of the executive. It means that ministers of the Crown are accountable to Parliament for their decisions and for the performance of their departments. It means that a government can govern as long, but only so long, as it has the confidence of the democratically elected Assembly. Now, what is implicit in this concept of responsible government is that the executive is comprised of, but is independent and distinguishable from, the members of the legislature. Canadians elect their legislatures. We do not elect our governments. Our constitutional convention, which include the concept of responsible government, mandates that the Governor-General will ask the leader of the party with the most support in Parliament, or the Lieutenant Governor in the Assembly, to form a government. But make no mistake, the government is chosen, it is not elected. As an illustration, Christy Clark, when first elected as leader of the BC Liberal Party, was sworn in as the Premier of British Columbia, notwithstanding that she did not at that moment hold a seat in the BC legislature. She served as Premier of British Columbia for several months before seeking and eventually obtaining a seat in a by-election. Then, in April's spring election, her party won a majority of the seats in Victoria, but she was defeated in her own Vancouver seat. She subsequently again was re-elected in a Kelowna seat in a by-election. But throughout it all, she remained the head of the government. Her premiership was uninterrupted, even though she was not an MLA. 2 times that she was premier. Now that brings us to the present-day conflict between balancing the role of a member of parliament to represent one's constituent versus a different role for the member of parliament that he or she serve as a mouthpiece for the party under whose banner he or she was elected. Parliamentary reformers such as myself and Elizabeth believe that a member of parliament should represent their constituents in Ottawa, not represent Ottawa to their constituents. However, too much freelancing will inevitably put a member of parliament offside his party leadership, and adjectives like maverick, rebel, rogue, and I've been called them all, will be applied to individuals who go offside. They will find themselves sitting on obscure committees or those with heavy workloads but no profile. They will find their names excluded from sought-after parliamentary junket lists. Now, I have no doubt that in the modern era of politics with the 24-hour news cycles, bloggers, and other social media of communication, the messaging is increasingly becoming more important to political advisors than the soundness of policy, and I say that with some regret, but I think it's true. Accordingly, any straying from approved party messaging is extremely frowned upon by political operatives, and probably correctly in their assessment, jeopardizes the electability or re-electability of that party. The question then becomes, as a backbench member of parliament, to what extent do I subject myself to their attempts at control? Speaking out on behalf of one's constituents and holding the government to account is the traditional and constitutional role of the member of parliament. Accordingly, comments that suggest a backbench MP should simply be an extension of the communication branch of PMO, of the Prime Minister's office, is really more of the novel, and I would suggest radical suggestion. Moreover, and in a university we all know this, fulsome debate is healthy, and a free exchange of ideas should be encouraged, even amongst like-minded caucus members. A unified caucus is not dependent on a unity of opinion. Now, I have been vocal for at least the last 2 years before I left the caucus that Parliament's role and a member of Parliament's role is to hold the government to account. Even when I was a member of the Conservative Party caucus, I challenged the government on supply management, on ministerial limousines, on ministerial respect for taxpayers and in their expense accounts, and on the protracted time scheduling for reducing the deficit and paying down the $650 billion national debt. Did these criticisms of my own government make me disloyal? Did they make me a maverick? Certainly not. I absolutely disagree with the notion that loyalty to government or to party requires that one blindly and without thinking support every detail that a government or party says or does. The constructive criticism of government cannot possibly be the equivalent of mutiny or even disloyalty. In fact, I would suggest that lackeys, sycophants, and yes-men are less valuable to a government's performance than the constructive critics, who demonstrate their loyalty by constantly challenging the government to continually perform even better. As the yes-man will blindly cheer at imminent policy derailment, the constructive critic, not shy of speaking truth to power, does the government that he serves a huge favor by advising his colleagues of the proposed policy's shortcomings. As an illustration, last year's proposed legislation on electronic surveillance, you might recall this. The government introduced its Internet Spy Bill with much fanfare, but civil libertarians, academics, and the media were much less enthusiastic about the prospect of having private emails intercepted. However, it was not until conservative backbenchers such as John Williamson from your neighboring province of New Brunswick started speaking publicly and that I started blogging on the matter that the government decided to first put the brakes on the problematic legislation, eventually wisely choosing to abandon it altogether. While sycophants and yes-men continue to make hyperbolic statements and unfair characterizations regarding the opponents of the legislation, you're either with us or you're with the child predators, it was the constructive critics inside the caucus who were ultimately responsible for the legislation shelving. Now, the current scandal of the executive and the former chief of staff to the Prime Minister gifting $90,000 to a sitting legislature in an alleged effort to make the expense scandal go away and salvage the reputation of the Conservative appointment represents an obvious and disturbing lack of separation between the executive and legislative branches of the Canadian government. But what Canadians do not appreciate is that in the Ottawa bubble, this lack of separation happens every day. The executive meddling in the affairs of the elected legislature, the affairs of the members of Parliament, and even parliamentary committees. If you followed my departure from the Conservative caucus, you will know that government members, Conservative members, were instructed by PMO to go in and gut my transparency bill. The executive, over a generation, has grown much too dominant and the Parliament much too weak, at times subservient. Sadly, this has evolved to the point that the executive or the government regards the legislative branch or parliament as an inconvenience and frequently without respect. Prorogations to avoid a confidence vote and 50-time allocations in a single parliamentary session is convincing of a government that would prefer to govern by fiat, by order in council, and by executive order than be accountable and answerable to an elected parliament. Now, Canada, for a variety of historical reasons, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of them tonight, has developed a party discipline that is beyond that experienced by most other functional democracies. The U.S. Congress frequently passes legislation passed on bipartisan support. We saw bipartisan support New Year's Eve on a budget bill to avoid a fiscal cliff, and recently bipartisan opposition defeated President Obama's legislative attempts to extend background checks on gun owners. I make no opinion on the soundness of either of those pieces of legislation. I only point them out to you as high-profile examples of the U.S. Congress working in an effective and functional bipartisan manner. Western European democracies similarly have matured to the point that a policy disagreement within a party is not the making of a constitutional crisis or the unmaking of a government or even a party. Late last month in Britain, Conservative backbenchers joined with opposition MPs to defeat a government motion to intervene in the Syrian civil war. Yet the government continued to govern and the world continues to rotate on its axes. Those who support ironclad party discipline and controlling messaging seem to want to make Parliament the equivalent of bad theatre. People such as myself with limited acting ability are handed talking points written by staffers. They read them with no actual debate ever taking place. And you've seen this, 1,000 times or maybe more?
Yes.
One group of individuals serve as the playwrights, and MPs are reduced to mere actors, reading from prepared text. Moreover, this perceived lack of efficacy of the individual member of Parliament and lack of real debate in the House of Commons is, in my view, the largest contributing factor to the complete lack of decorum in the current House of Commons. With votes being determined by the party leadership and whips, there's no purpose for members in following a debate because they'll be instructed on how to vote. But worse, we reduce the House of Commons to the equivalent of the U.S. Electoral College. Under my analogy, Parliament would meet after an election to determine which leader has the most support in Parliament, and thereafter, all votes would break strictly on party lines once it is known how the respective leaders are voting. It seems wastefully expensive, especially for small C conservatives such as myself, for the equivalent of the U.S. Electoral College to meet 27 weeks per year, having its members travel great distances to do so, if its only function is to provide unequivocal support for the respective leaders. It is indeed sad when a member of Parliament is reduced to a mere automaton, dependent and loyal to his or her party above loyalty to him or herself or to his constituents. The result of an executive becoming increasingly unanswerable and therefore unaccountable is that Canadian taxpayers and Canadian citizens are increasingly shut out of the decision-making process. Government listening only to its political advisors and its bureaucrats means that citizens are shut out, and that's bad for democracy and it's bad for governance and ultimately leads to bad policy. Our system would benefit greatly if the experience and qualifications of the members of Parliament were more strongly emphasized, or at least were emphasized, in the policy-making process, and if members of Parliament paid as much deference to their constituents as they do to their whips. Alternatively, we turn the clock back to 175 years where we once again revisit a system where an all-too-power executive is accountable to no one other than itself. Responsible government, born here in Halifax, was the solution to said problem 175 years ago when the governor and his executive council were not accountable to the people's legislature. Libertarians, and I remember the first time I called myself a libertarian in the House and you laughed at me.
I didn't laugh at you. I was horrified. It's all right. I have such respect for this man. We're just teasing each other, but I'll talk later. I've never laughed at you, Brent. Never.
You said you never heard anyone refer to themselves as a libertarian.
In the House, yeah. No, you were the first.
Libertarians believe that the greatest threat to freedom is the unchecked concentration of power. Even well-intentioned leaders must be subject to checks and balances. Holding to account vets bad legislation and improves good legislation. Holding to account constantly challenges the government of the day to perform even better. Holding to account makes mediocre executives better, good cabinets great, and defeats bad governments. However, if you consider yourself to be part of the government, as many CPC conservative backbenchers do, you cannot possibly provide checks and balances to the government. You cannot be a meaningful check upon yourself. You cannot simultaneously be cheerleader and constructive critic. Having a democratically elected chamber hold to account the appointed executive is the essence of responsible government and is fundamental to both democratic accountability and good governance. Had the Conservative Party of Canada caucus and Parliament genuinely done a better job in holding the current government to account, the government presumably would be performing better. The current government would benefit from a Parliament that actually holds it to account. Thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
So what we have is an abomination. You've heard what Brent said. I will go farther and say
why have our political parties essentially turned into fundraising and election machines rather than vehicles for developing good public policy?
That however unsexy democratic renewal is, it's perhaps the most important political issue of our time.